What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. Writ small, the story of the Golden Gauntlet yesterday was unhelpful Yoda on his Supergiant deck, but I think writ large, the story of the Golden Gauntlet yesterday was small mid-range and tech decks adjusting to beat the biggest threats in the game. Shadow King was the most played card in the entire field, and normally when a card is played at a very high rate, it trends towards a 50% win rate, but Shadow King was instead pushing 60. In large part, this isn't due to the influence of the Captain Carter combo deck, but it's also due to a wide variety of other factors that are necessary in order to keep various combo shenanigans from going over the top of mid-range decks. Whenever you play a deck like this, your number one question should be, what is my answer in this situation? What is my answer to this deck? What is my answer to this setup? Supergiant has consistently been an answer to a wide variety of setups, not necessarily hamstringing all of them, but it's very reminiscent of when Sholau and Star-Lord both needed turn 5 to different degrees. Supergiant was much better against Star-Lord, but she was still perfectly acceptable against Sholau. And I group this list a lot more in with the Techno-Organic Virus decks than I do with the traditional other versions of tech decks. This has much more in common with TOV than it does with Sarah Control, for example. But what this list is trying to do is play efficient points with efficient tech, and as long as your tech lines up well, and you have to use Supergiant well to make sure that that happens, you will end up in very solid and very powerful positions. This is a very powerful list that has a ton of play to it, but is still remarkably difficult to get the full 100% output out of. I've talked a little bit about the various dynamics of Techno-Organic Virus lists, and this list from Andre Var is pretty close to what I would consider the best version of TOV. Andre Var lost in top 16, Movi took it as far as the top 4 before losing to Unhelpful Yoda in a very tight, quote-unquote, quasi-mirror matchup. This is the reason I think that TOV is as good as it is because it can support a wide variety of different play styles. Techno-Organic Virus can be used in decks like this to support a bunch of tech cards and also to make sure that your Wilson Fisk hits 10 so you can play Scar. But the best thing that Techno-Organic Virus does is drag Mobius along with it. Mobius being a core part of your engine means that X amount of combo decks are just cut off at the source. Then you also have Shadow King, and this is the one I think is actually important, Cosmic Ghost Rider. If I'm ranking the importance of tech cards in this list, it is Mobius 1 because he's part of your engine, so maybe that's cheating, Shadow King, and then CGR. Stardust and Armor are nice to have, but those three are the ones that are incredibly important. And the biggest reason for that is that CGR is what takes you from not necessarily having a great matchup against the Captain Carter combo decks and giving you a legitimately straight up playable one. The reason I put these two decks at the front is because they're both kind of doing the same thing. What can we do as our small tech deck to actually go over the top and beat and stop those combo decks? Yoda ended up on Supergiant, and of course Movi and Andre Var ended up on TOV with CGR. But again, it's about respecting your opponents here, respecting what they're going to bring to the table and what they're going to do. Because one of the things that both of these decks are weak to is, frankly, any deck that just goes taller than them that isn't vulnerable to this stuff. I watch Andre Var legitimately struggle with a very normal Ajax Afflict deck, which is not a matchup a lot of people have on their radar, but it dodges basically everything that he is capable of bringing to bear. And I think that that is a great lesson in how to play around these decks, because with Supergiant's second consecutive Golden Gauntlet victory, it's very easy to think that this is the kind of thing that's just always going to be good. But it's good in the context in which it exists, and that means that there are always going to be loopholes to take advantage of too. Captain Carter combo was a list that had a target on its back during the Golden Gauntlet, and that is an earned target on its back. This is still a very powerful list. Even in a Golden Gauntlet field that was chock full of Shadow Kings, it was still above 50%. This is really solid. Now, you might be surprised to see a Galactus in the list. That is actually mirror tech. That's the idea here. You can use this as a way to prevent your opponents, if you have priority, from actually accessing a lot of their stick power. So the Galactus is there for mirrors and pretty much no other reason. He does do a little bit of aura farming, and I know people are going to think this is a gag or a joke, but no, Galactus is actually a very powerful piece of mirror tech in a world where you have to respect that. Now, I go back and forth on whether Silver Surfer should legitimately be in this archetype. He is probably the worst card in the deck, and that counts Galactus, but he does give you a little bit more some of the time than what a Cosmo would give you or what a Loot Cage would give you, but both of those are much more matchup relevant cards, so you might end up taking this deck that direction. When we look at what the metagame has become and how hard targeted this deck has become, it's definitely the kind of thing that maybe it goes back into its shell for a couple of weeks, or maybe it finds a way to adapt to what people are doing. Cosmo is definitely a way to make that happen. This deck has points for days. It doesn't need all of those points in order to make sure that it's going to win those matchups. But maybe the target on its back is just too heavy. Maybe there's just too much Shadow King for this deck to succeed to the potential that it actually wants to succeed to. And I'm really interested to see, now that a bunch of people have caught on to how this deck is actually trying to win the game, whether it's going to be able to continue to put up its incredibly impressive high infinite numbers, or whether its performances are going to mirror how it's looked in Golden Gauntlet and at lower ranks, which is to say a pretty clear second to TOV, despite the fact that I think most high infinite players would tell you this is the one they're actually scared of. A bunch of the multiple man players in the field yesterday did very well. None of them made the top 16, but it was still a very solidly high performing deck. And I think that's in part due to player bias. A lot of very good players gassed this deck pretty hard. I think it's a good deck, but it has some awkward and weak draws that a lot of the better decks in the metagame tend not to have. One of the upsides of consistency that I think often gets overlooked is that you just get to play more hands, and this is a relatively inconsistent deck, but sometimes it is just doing things that are undeniably incredibly strong, like setting up some multiple men over the course of the game, final turn Juggernaut with a Doctor Strange. Tons of really powerful things are available to you in this deck. There's a ton of play. There's a lot of power. This is a deck that I think actually has a very good matchup into the Carter stuff, and occasionally a good matchup into the other stuff, because as a green power deck, being the version of a green power deck that already has Juggernaut and Cosmo baked in is a real upside for what this list is trying to do. Being the deck that has the counter interaction included is quite useful, and this deck has always come locked and loaded with Juggernaut Cosmo. It's definitely a powerful list that can do some real damage in the hands of an experienced pilot, but honestly, more than any other list in the game, except maybe the Captain Carter one, this is one of the hardest decks in the game to play. Phantom X fell off for reasons that genuinely make no sense to me. To me, this is the best quote-unquote off-meta deck in the game, to the point that I wouldn't even describe it as off-meta. It's just a good deck. Like, people seem to think that this is somehow, for some reason, a deck that is not a meta-level deck, and it absolutely is. This is a deck that has the core of Mobius and Shadow King and Killmonger. This gives it very solid matchups into a variety of different lists. Killmonger has gotten worse against TOV, but it's still very good. And if you run into people playing Shadowlands Daredevil, I mean, God forbid. Shadow King is obviously the best tech card in the game. Mobius is immensely powerful, and being a deck that afflicts all of the time is incredibly useful in a world where people are trying to launder the buffs on their Mavericks and Captain Carters, so you have Marrow and Phantom X to make that just not happen. As much as I would like to be able to describe this as the best off-meta deck in the game, I have too much respect for it. This is a meta deck that people, for some reason, just don't play. It is an absolutely incredibly powerful list that you should be prepared for, because it is a very real threat in this modern era of Marvel Snap. And if you see a bunch of people playing Venus and things of that nature, this deck is built to beat a million different permutations of Venus decks by Shadow Kinging them and then doing its own point plan in a powerful, straightforward, and easy to understand way. Phantom X is incredibly underrated. I refuse to call him off meta. Magic is a card that I think shows up a lot in Golden Gauntlet metagames along with Shang-Chi. They were both in the top 10. They both had, if I'm not mistaken, the worst win rates in the top 10. This is not particularly surprising if you pay attention to Golden Gauntlets the way I do. It's pretty consistent that people bring Magic decks and they bring Shang-Chi decks, and those decks are bad in Golden Gauntlets. I'm not saying that's predicted for the future, but if you asked me what card in the top 10 was going to be the least good, I would have said Magic. And I think a lot of that is down to how good other decks are at having that turn 7 and dealing with what you're doing in a Magic deck. And I think a lot of it is also down to we don't have as many good Magic decks anymore. And Zombie Galacti has been sort of carrying the flame for Magic for basically since the Onslaught nerf, where it's like we used to be a whole sector of the metagame where people would do weird doubling stuff that like something cool would happen eventually. We've been doing Living Tribunal, doing Onslaught Mr. Fantastic, been doing Wong Gambit. Ever since they changed that, it's kind of just been Zombie Galacti in the Magic payoff land. And that has made me feel, a little bit empty, a little bit sad inside. And Zombie Galacti is like doing a pretty good job of being a Magic deck. The real fatal flaw of Zombie Galacti is just this Magic deck that if you give an extra turn to the Captain Carter combo deck, they're better at using that extra turn than you. Like, I'll play against Zombie Galacti, and unless that Galacti's getting to 20, I don't think I'm that worried. Like, I think I'm just going to outpower them over the course of 7 turns because I'm going to combo off harder than they do. And that's really the nail in the coffin of these Magic decks, is if you give the Carter deck an extra turn and you're not interacting with them, that's really, really bad. Now, if the metagame gets real small and people stop playing the Carter deck and everyone's just playing these mid-rangey Shadow King decks that have plans to beat the Carter deck, but nobody's actually playing the Carter deck, then yeah, Magic, Zombie Galacti, suddenly it's a very real threat again. But I don't know that that's how things are going to go for this list. Flat 5-1 the Golden Gauntlet with his patented Splat pile. So while we're talking about Magic decks, let's try to breathe some new life into that sector of the metagame a little bit. This is a deck that was previously known as the Arms deck, and it used to be way, way better. This deck used to have a legitimate combo draw where you copied Onslaughts and Prodigies and Mystiques with Fantastic, and you would get like 100 points in the side lanes, and it was awesome, and you don't have access to that now. What you do have access to is a bunch of power dropped on the final turn of the game, including a Shadow King, which is just going to be decent enough a lot of the time. And that is the premise of this list, is that even though they have taken away our combo, they cannot take away the fact that we cheat a bunch of energy, and we're still going to cheat that energy. Please do not Mobius me. Thank you. Now, this is a list that has a lot of inbuilt points, being able to do things like Iron Man lane, Mystique under a Moonstone, Onslaught the Iron Man lane. The ceiling is still really high. It's just not as easy to hit the ceiling as it used to be before the Onslaught change, and it is more beatable than it used to be before the Onslaught change. But I do think that maybe there are other spaces in the metagame that Magic can support that aren't necessarily just going to get run over 100% of the time. Because I think we've seen a pretty consistent pattern of Magic underperforming at even relatively high levels of play, let alone at the highest levels of play. I genuinely don't know when the last time a Magic deck, if a Magic deck has ever made the top 4 of a Golden Gauntlet. I'm not sure. I think maybe they've been a top 16 Magic deck, but she's definitely been a card that has been showing up in large numbers and underperforming pretty consistently. And now that a lot of her decks have also had power taken out of them, I am a little worried, but there is still stuff to be done in the space. I've been trying to figure out when to talk about V-Hand in this video because I feel like I've fallen for a pump fake so many times with this deck, which is I'm going to make a pronouncement right now. And obviously I can't predict the future, but V-Hand has consistently been what I think you might reasonably describe as the queen of tier 2. She will be the best deck in the game for 2 days until we figure out what actually beats her after every single nerf. Every time something changes in this game, V-Hand is the 3rd best deck in the game, or the 4th best deck in the game, or the 5th best deck in the game, and they're nerfing all the decks ahead of her, and it's like, okay, they've nerfed all the decks ahead of V-Hand, now it's V-Hand's time to be the best deck in the game, and then nothing changes. She ends up being, in the new metagame, the 3rd best deck in the game, the 4th best deck in the game, the 5th best deck in the game. It's hard to go wrong with her. She is performing at an extremely consistent level. You are not going to get bad performances out of Victoria Hand, but you are not going to win a championship with this card. It's just born to be a second round playoff out. The Carmelo Anthony of Marvel Snap. Just a great card, very confusing and conflicted legacy, but a great card. And this is just a card that I think you're going to have to accept that's what this is. That's what V-Hand is until something drastic changes about Marvel Snap, because consistently there has been these metagames where it's like, okay, here's the best mid-range deck and here's the best combo deck, and V-Hand is below both of them, and then they nerf the best mid-range deck and they nerf the best combo deck, and V-Hand ends up below both the next best mid-range and combo deck, and it's happened too many times and I refuse to ignore it anymore. A player named ACP, who longtime fans may remember from a couple Golden Gauntlets ago, being a player who I think crushed deck building with a zombie list. After that time, he reached out to me and gave me a pretty detailed explanation of why he made the decisions that he made. Apparently, he's been a pretty good player in other card games before, and he reached out to me after this one to say, like, hey, I made top 4 with Arishem. I thought it was like a deck that people are really underrating, and we talked for a little bit about it. And what I got out of it was that this is a deck that relies on your opponent really being curious. This is a deck that sort of operates as a mousetrap, right? This deck says, hey, look, what's behind the box? Don't you want to find out what I have? And then what you have is like really, really bad. You're really, really bad for them, right? And I think that largely my analysis of matchups with Arishem is that the smaller things go, like the more towards a Supergiant deck you go, the less favored you are into Arishem. When you look at Unhelpful Yoda's list, when you look at Andre Var's list, the more tech you're running, the less good you are into Arishem, the more reliant you are on TOV to overpower them on points. But for example, when you run into one of those TOV lists that's playing Scar and Sasquatch and the 10s, it's basically impossible to lose the matchup against Arishem. And my theory of Arishem is, at a certain point threshold, you are just going to be unfavored as the Arishem gamer, but the smaller mid-range gets, the more interactive mid-range gets, the more down to the ground tech cardy mid-range gets, the better Arishem becomes, because it just plays a lot of threats that are difficult to predict and difficult to tech card, because you don't know what the hell's actually going to happen in the game. And I think that we could be heading into a metagame where Arishem is actually a good thing to be seeing. If people pick up a bunch of Andre Var lists, if people pick up a bunch of the Unhelpful Yoda lists, these are the kind of things that Arishem sort of actively wants to see. Or what it doesn't want to see is anyone doing synergy stuff. It does not want to see a Scar. It does not want to see a Sauron Typhoid Mary. It does not want to see anyone stacking points big enough that it doesn't really matter how many energy you have in the game. That's the thing. And Arishem sort of always lives on that line. And I think that in as much as the metagame in the winner's bracket did end up being pretty favorable to Arishem, pretty good read from ACP. Jay Walla playing C4 made it all the way to the top 16. There were actually 2 C4 decks in the top 16. Very underrated story of the tournament. They were 1 card off from each other. Jay Walla was playing this version, I believe, and I think the only difference in the other one was the inclusion of Goose, which is a very fun little addition, a little wrinkle with Mother Askani. Now, people might ask, what the hell are you doing with a Mother Askani in your deck? Won't that mess you up? And yeah, kind of, but you can Shadow King your stuff down, or you can hit a Luke Cage, or you can hit a Cerebro, and all that stuff is typically worth doing. You can even hit a Nico if she's not going to like double things up. Mother Askani is just that level of card that you kind of want to play it, but the real star here, frankly, is just being a Shadow King Invisible Woman deck, and that gives you so many favorable matchups into all sorts of things. Whether your opponent is playing various Venus things, which we haven't talked a lot about, but I've seen tons of people playing around with that card. I haven't seen anything that is particularly compelling to like break into, say, tier 1 or something like that, but she's in 7 different tier 2 decks that you will see, and they will be running around. Like, you'll see people playing the zombie list or whatever, or Bishop Angela, and she will be there, right? You'll see people playing traditional Surfer list, and she will be there. And so just being IWSK deck is so great. IW does double duty here. She protects your stuff from various combo things or removal, and that is incredibly powerful, but she also delays your Shadow King if you need to do that. Great work from both of the C4 players in the top 16. Didn't work out for either of them in the long term, but they did very well to get that far. And I think it demonstrates just how much Cerebro's power is relative to the tech cards that it gets to run at any given time, and how well those tech cards match up into the metagame. This was the Shadow King metagame, so the Cerebro that played Shadow King, that's the good one. You might know this spot on the tier list as the sort of destroy honorary spot on the tier list, where we put a deck that people play, but that I find it a little bit difficult to recommend. For me right now, that is a lot of Venus decks. These are really cool. There's a lot of really cool things happening in the Venus space. I think that this card has done more good for Marvel Snap as a card than many releases have. Because what Venus has done is go in a bunch of very medium decks and make them legitimately more respectable. In a different world, this could be an actually busted card. But unfortunately, in the world we live in, Shadow King exists and takes a lot of this stuff to the woodshed. And they aren't even playing Shadow King for you. The problem that Venus and Jeff specifically are running into is that people are playing Shadow King for other matchups, and they're just hitting you by accident. You're catching strays. And this is a list that does a ton of like really interesting stuff. I love zombie decks. I love Kitty Pryde. This is my favorite card in Marvel Snap, dude. I can't genuinely recommend it because of the metagame positioning. You end up in a metagame position where you are losing to the people playing Captain Carter combo because you don't have good interaction for them. Then you're also losing to the people trying to beat Captain Carter combo because they have good interaction for you just by virtue of the same cards that work against Captain Carter combo working against you. I would love to play a deck like this and not feel like I was giving up equity. And I'm not to say that you should feel bad for playing this or that it's a bad deck or anything. It's just that it's very difficult to choose to play a deck in a sector of a metagame dominated by one deck that isn't that deck when everyone is playing all the cards that beat you by accident. And it's a hard space to want to opt into from a perspective of I would like to win games. But I really can't stress enough how awesome it is that Venus does this, because Horde is an archetype that doesn't get support cards. They're not printing other Horde cards, right? It was meant to be a self-contained package, so how do you make this package stronger? Well, you print a card like Venus, and what Venus says effectively is whenever you Horde, Horde +1. It's awesome. Like, it's so cool. This is one of the coolest cards they've ever made. It's so cool. It's so sick. Unfortunately, it's just doing green power in a Shadow King meta. And by the way, if any of you doubt my I love zombies bona fides here, look at those variants. You think I'd be buying the Rian Gonzalez zombie chibis for all of these cards if this wasn't an archetype that I loved? Come on now. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one. Have a wonderful evening.